Welcome to the Recruiting Stories podcast, where we celebrate recruiting by exploring the stories of leaders and top performers by digging into their stories and understanding how recruiting has impacted their journey and their success. All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Recruiting Stories podcast. This time I'm flying solo. I'm excited to talk with you guys, just me, about a few topics this year that I think are going to be really helpful for you as you grow your business, or as a candidate, maybe what you can do to position yourself well in the marketplace. So we're going to change things up here with the Recruiting Stories podcast a little bit. We're still going to have outstanding guests that we're going to interview over the year and following years, but we'll also have some moments where I'm going to just stop and talk with you about a topic that's going to be helpful for you as you try to scale your company, as you try to grow your freight brokerage or your freight tech company, your trucking company, or whatever you're growing here in the transportation industry. I see a lot of common thread. We have common conversations with leadership as I talk with them about, hey, how do we grow our company? How do we find the right people? How do we scale? And today, we're actually going to talk about recruiting strategy versus hiring process. So what you're going to see is two different types of conversations coming out of this podcast here when it's just me. There's going to be one that's focused on organizations and companies. We're going to talk about the hiring process and or scaling businesses, helping grow that. And then you're also going to see me talking specifically to candidates. Hey, candidates, how can you position yourself well to get into your dream job, get into a career that is fulfilling, long-lasting, meaningful, and using your skill set in the best way possible. So you'll see both of those. We'll probably go back and forth each month with one over the other. So this one is recruiting strategy versus hiring process. Why am I talking about that? The reason that I'm talking about that is it's a common misconception. I'll get into conversations with, a company and, they may say something like, hey, we do want to grow. And I'll ask about the process, ask about what they're doing right now. And they'll say, we've got a good hiring process, or we don't need a recruiter. We don't need help because we're doing this. And so when I ask them what this means, oftentimes they'll tell me about, something they're proud of, and that's okay. But what they're proud of is often their hiring process. And their hiring process consists something like, hey, we have somebody in-house who knows how to collect resumes or post job postings. Someone in-house writes the job descriptions. Maybe even they go out and do a little bit of recruiting on LinkedIn because, they've had some success here and there earlier on in the business. And then their process is like, well, we get a hold of them or we filter through the resumes and then we bring them in and, we have them go through a round robin interview with 3 or 4 people. We have some really clever questions that we've come up with. We might even have a personality assessment that we put them through. Then, once we feel good about it, we make an offer. And once we give that offer, we feel like we're closing the deal with the candidate. And then we have a background check and so on and so forth to help onboard that person. So they're really proud of that process. The problem is that is wildly and vastly different than an actual recruiting strategy. That's the back end of the process, right? From a recruiting strategy process, there is so much that you have to consider on the front end, right? So I want to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the recruiting strategy first. We'll talk about this week. Next week, we're going to talk about your hiring process, okay? So recruiting strategy and why it's different. We talked about that a little bit. Recruiting strategy is very much the active hunting portion of going after the type of talent that you need. As a company, let's just say you're like, hey, we've hit a point where we're kind of stagnant. We've got a few salespeople and, they're at capacity. Our operations people are at capacity. We feel like to grow, we need to go hire new salespeople or new account managers, or we need to invest in technology or whatever. You decided what you need, but that's part of it, right? The first thing you need to do is identify your hiring triggers. Okay, so first step in your recruiting strategy is, what are our hiring triggers? What revenue metric do we need to hit that says, okay, now we have the money to cash flow or pay for another person? If you don't know that, you need to know that. And you need to decide, okay, what is that? Then what are we going to invest in? Now that we have the money, what are we going to invest in? Next thing that you're going to have to do is identify the role that makes the most sense for your growth. Oftentimes for many companies, that's sales, right? So let's use sales as an example. So now we can go invest and go out and find a salesperson. We can recruit a salesperson. Well, we can't just get any person off the street to sell. We all know that. It's hard. Salespeople get beat up. It takes a unique person to do that. So we need to create a job description. That's the next thing. So we got to identify the hiring triggers. We have to identify the role. So let's say sales in this instance. Then we need to create a job description, and not just a job description that we copied and pasted off Google, but actually tells the individual what they are doing and what success looks like. More so, what we need to do is we need to create metrics. We need to create a metrics that tell that person, this is how you succeed in this role. You need to be making this many phone calls, outbound phone calls. You need to be having conversations on the phone for this amount of time per day. You need to be closing at this percentage. You need to be creating this much gross margin monthly, weekly, for you to be succeeding. If you do not have metrics in place, it's very hard. It's a moving target. It's very difficult for people to know if they can succeed or not. Great book on that, on creating metrics that will help you succeed in a business that I'm a big fan of is the 4 Disciplines of Execution. If you haven't read that, go read that book. It may change how you create job descriptions and metrics, especially in the transportation industry. That said, now that you have metrics that help you know this is what someone can do to succeed, this is this job description, this is what they are doing. Now I need to know what person is typically good at that. What traits do they have that will allow them to succeed? So here's where I see also people fail oftentimes. I'll see people say, hey, man, this type of person is so good. I say, wait, what leads you to believe that? And they'll typically point to one person or a couple people that they knew and or liked. There's nothing wrong with that, and they may not be totally wrong, but you're typically basing that opinion on like 1 or 2 experiences. And so the best thing to do is go create actionable data. How can I go back and look at our organization and say, hey, what are some traits that we can look at? Can we identify traits from people that we have in the role currently that are successful versus those who aren't? Do we have a personality assessment? We'll get to that question later. Do we have, a background that they typically come from that helps us know, yeah, that typically seems to be more successful than others? I don't know what those are. You're going to have to find those out. But the best way to do it is to do a self-evaluation with actionable data and say, okay, let's go figure out what that is. What is that trait? Is it extroversion versus introversion? Is it, someone who is competitive? How do you measure that? Is it someone who is driven? How do you measure that? You need to be able to find those things and be able to measure them internally and see if that translates to success in the role that you're discussing. Otherwise, it may not be very helpful for you. But if you can find it, great. Now you can go find where those fish live, right? If I know that I want a certain type of fish, I go to a certain river, I go to a certain lake. And that's how I go and find those people. So now I have to ask the question, okay, if I know what I need to be successful, I know what traits are needed to succeed, I know what the job description is, where do we find those people? Okay, so we've got to ask that. If we identify that, maybe we know that it's, hey, in this, specific region, these people typically seem to be just hungry for success. And we want to go find more of those. Salespeople often, I am a big fan of student athletes or people in the military for a number of reasons I can explain on another podcast. Let's say I want to target those. Okay, well, then who should recruit them should be your next question. Who should recruit them? Not, hey, let's just go hit up every student athlete or every military member that there is. We also need to think about what is our best hook, right? If we're using the fishing analogy, what bait should we use, right? So who should recruit them? Number one, do we have someone that's skilled, that speaks that language already? That could be a good person to connect with the individual. Should it be someone doing the job already from that background? Might be something to think about. Additionally, what is our value proposition, right? Why would someone want to come work for us in our organization with our values versus all the millions of opportunities that are out there? This is another one I see companies fail at a lot. They just assume that people think that they are so great, and they may have never heard of your logistics organization. May not know. So you have to think about who is doing the recruiting, what your value proposition is, and why they're going to want to be interested in that. When, let's just say, if they've been at a 4-year college, they don't know about your $200-300 million a year freight brokerage or trucking company. They know about Apple and Google and Microsoft and Salesforce. And there's nothing wrong with those companies, but they're comparing your role and your culture and your environment to what they see on the internet, and what their friend who got a job in San Francisco is doing. And that's the world we live in today. So as much as we want to think, hey, I'm competing against the freight brokerage next to me in town. No, you are competing against Apple and Google and all these places. So you got to think about, hey, how do we say our value is a good fit for who you are and where you're going? Okay, so now that you have your value proposition, you know who's recruiting them, you know where to find these people, and you have the traits that are going to succeed. You've created metrics to help them know how to be successful. Now you have to deploy that talent. Okay, so how then do we deploy that talent? Well, we got to figure out who's kind of going to be involved in jumping into that process. So there's a few places that you can look to start there. Obviously, internally, a lot of times it's going to be managers. Could be an internal recruiter. Could be an external recruiter. Could be someone like Cover 3 Consulting. It could be a marketing team, right? And so getting those people in the same room and saying, hey, here's what we have to find. Here's why we're different. Here's who we are is extremely important. Once you're all on the same page, now it's time to say, hey, we know what we're looking for. Ready, break. We've broken the huddle. And we're going to go out. We know specifically what to recruit for, what to fight for, and what success should look like. Now, from there, the next step, is going to evaluate what you bring in. So obviously, the next step we're going to talk about is that hiring process. Okay, there's a whole process behind, LinkedIn recruiting, career fair recruiting, word of mouth recruiting, referrals, setting up referrals for your company, referral bonuses for your people. That's a great way to find people. There's strategies in each one of those, and we'll get to those things. But you got to know who's doing the recruiting first, and you need a point person in your company. So if you don't have a point person, there needs to be one person that it should always come back to who speaks the language. They're going to be what I would call like your culture hero, right? Someone who can speak the language of who your culture is. They embody that culture, and they also know how to recruit. They can speak the language of the roles that you're trying to recruit for. That might be a few different people, right? That might be somebody different for data analysts than it is salespeople or software engineers. You might have different people recruiting in those different areas. Probably you should. Early on, you might not, but later on, you may need to. So that being said, all right, that's kind of what I wanted to preface and start with here, okay? Your recruiting strategy, you have to have one, all right? We've got to think about all those things first before we dive in. If we don't, the question that people are going to ask is like, well, why should I go to work for you versus someone else? If you haven't answered the question, who you are as an organization, why you exist, you need to go, read the book, Start With Why, right? Simon Sinek book. Take some time and really identify your values as a company, and why you serve both your client and the people that work for you. we'll talk about that on another episode as well. But looking forward to digging into this more with you guys. If this is helpful, give us a rating on all the social platforms that you're on. Give us a rating on iTunes or Spotify, and share it with a friend. We'll have more next time. We'll be talking a little bit about the hiring process, specifically a structured hiring process that will help you make sure that you're filtering through the right people first. And we'll talk about that next time. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening to the Recruiting Stories podcast. If you haven't yet, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Check us out on LinkedIn. Adrian Chapman and Cover 3 Consulting is our company page. Also check out our website, www.cov3consulting.com. Again, thanks for joining us, and we just simply want to remind you that you can change the world by putting people in a position where they can do the most good, and you do that by recruiting. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.